Michael. Hi, everyone. Just a sort of brief introduction. I spent about 15 years in agencies before I decided to leave the agency world and joined Ebiquity earlier this year. The next 20 minutes is really about, I guess, the choices you have, or advertisers and procurement people have, when looking at digital. Within the Media UK practice, one of our sub-practices is media management. As part of that, helping clients select agencies and understand how to sort of deploy those capabilities in-house, which Tim will come on to talk about, but also the partnerships with the respective partners and agencies. So kind of framing the choices you have as advertisers. Do you consolidate? Do you see digital as one thing? Do you just put it into your agency of record? Or do you fragment it out? And I'm sure many of you will have a perspective on this as well. So digital is now more than half of the total UK ad investment. In the space of 10 years, so from 2008, when it was about 20%, it's come a very long way, right? And with that, complexity, right? The complexity, that is all the different formats we have. And in those 10 years, we've seen the birth of programmatic, native, various new formats, but also how those formats are delivered, the new methods of buying. So it's getting increasingly complex. The other thing that adds to that complexity is, at some point in the 10 years, the year of mobile happened. Not quite sure which year that was. But in the space of 10 years, it finally happened, right? And what's happened now is that in search and various other disciplines, actually tablets and mobile devices, the ad spend is increasingly higher, or getting close to sort of half of the spend against traditional desktop and laptops, right? So how do you make sense of that complexity when it's constantly fragmenting and getting exponentially harder to make sense of, right? So you as advertisers have choice, and many of you, I'm sure, have made a choice in terms of the model, as you have a broader range of ways of organizing digital. And we can't really talk about this subject without talking about control, right? Because the key reason, the key argument to move away from a consolidated model where you, in simple terms, give digital to your media agency is to have a high degree of control, right? And we know that clients or advertisers like Unilever, GSK, RBS, HP, some of you, I'm sure, have openly said, well, we want more control, right? It's getting really complicated. There's obviously the whole transparency issue and whatnot, which we'll talk about later. But there is a need for many advertisers to have a higher degree of control. And to achieve that control, you know, and this is somewhat simplified, but you have a number of different options, and there are more options than the ones here in how you organize digital and whether you fragment it out, right? And in our practice, where advertisers, you know, are asking our questions around, well, how should I organize it? You know, what questions do I need to ask? And actually the question before I even start looking at in-housing or looking at whether where I put things is, how do I organize digital? How do I brief it out? How do I scope it out? Is it one brief or is it several briefs, right? And then you can start to think about, well, actually, you know, if I want control, I need to fragment it out somehow, right? I need to think about working with several partners to achieve best in class, because ultimately, you would really only fragment the brief out to get best in class, right? The best partner within a certain area. So the way that we talk about this with our clients when they come to us with this question about, well, how do I organize digital? Where do I put things, and how do I do it? Is, as a starting point, well, consolidation really is about efficiency or cost, right? It makes a lot of things easier It's easier to integrate with traditional media. You've only got one or a few partners, so clearer accountability. It's less process intensive because you have one or fewer partners, so you don't need to think about process, and therefore you don't necessarily need to have huge amounts of resource or people managing the relationships and the processes in-house. The reason for fragmenting the brief is really about objectivity or neutrality in the system, right? It's a bit like the sort of philosophical planning and buying. Do I put it together? Do I separate it? Well, you separate it out if you want neutrality and objectivity in the system, or you bring it together if you want efficiency, right? And what you're able to do, and what more and more advertisers are doing, is going, well, I want the best in class. Cost is important, but it's less important compared to the past. I want the best in class. I want to be able to build my own media management model and make things fit together, as opposed to just a turnkey solution from an agency. And I want that high degree of control we talked about. And often, independent measurement, right? I don't want my agency or someone who's biased to measure my media and my outcomes. If we take a step back, and really the starting point is, a fair degree of introspection is important in any organization before making these decisions, right? So a few examples in terms of where you would start, and as I've said, a reality check, because you've got to know your own organization, as I'm sure you all do first, before you move ahead with decisions about where you put your media and where you put your digital, right? So are you, for example, are you a procurement cost-led in your media strategy? Are you a marketing or capability-led organization in your media strategy, right? That makes a real difference philosophically. It impacts how media is treated. Do you treat your media agency as a supplier? I'm sure that's a no. I'm sure you're all over here, right? But there are degrees of grey, if you'd like, on that scale. Is media cost or is media an investment, right? And again, what are the conversations you're having as marketeers and procurement, or maybe marketeers with your procurement department, about marketing and media and how it's perceived? And therefore, understanding these questions and additional questions like these, sort of this versus that, will help you build an idea of, or paint a picture of, well, actually, consolidation is probably the route for us to take, or fragmentation is the route for us to take. So if we go back in time again, sort of 2008, or the time that kind of precedes where we are now, the last 2 years maybe, with the advent of digital and the things I mentioned in terms of programmatic and native and all the things that have happened in the last 10 years, the subjectivity and the intangible value in digital is a real challenge to many of our clients, I'm sure to you as well, is, well, how do we make sense of it, right? Because in the past, the best pricing, the best commercials, the numbers side, it's pretty straightforward when making a decision about which partners to work with or your media management model. You would base it on the best proposal, price-wise, commercially, right? Low level of subjectivity, you're able to compare, easy to evaluate, easy to quantify and measure, right? That was the decision, or the basis of which you made your decision when selecting partners. Fast forward again to where we are now, and have been in the last 2-3 years, we all want the best. As advertisers, we want the best strategy, we want the best capability, we want the best talent, and we want the best media management model. So consolidation or fragmentation or any option in between. But that's really hard to understand. It's really hard to measure. It's a high level of subjectivity. You can speak to Google or Adobe or agencies or whomever, and you know that there is an agenda, right? So how do you make sense of it? How do you go, this is the best option for me, I want to consolidate or fragment, and I want to build it like this, and I want these partners, and I want to evaluate it like this. because of this high level of subjectivity. It's hard to quantify, it's hard to measure, and that is where we help our clients to make sense of that. Because ultimately you want this, right? You want the best partnership, and actually whether you talk digital or whether you talk all media, that is what you want commercially. And of course commercially, this side often still is the most important part, certainly is a core aspect of any evaluation. But as you set up for best practice and you look to the future, the next 2, 3, 5 years, you've got to make sure you've got this sorted as well, right? I'm sure many of you have already. So we zoom back out, and I think about sort of the last year, 2 years, the trends we've observed in helping clients select agencies and partners. We've seen many trends, but 4 core trends. A more focused and more detailed briefs. So, if you go back again, there used to be one brief and it was kind of top line and it really talked about media only. Today, you get a more articulated ambition. You get clear requirements in terms of the business impact that advertisers are looking for from their partners, from their agencies. And as I said, in terms of fragmentation, you more and more get separate scopes to go, a really detailed explanation of what we want to achieve with data and programmatic versus traditional media, right? So instead of that being one sort of scope, one document, one brief, more and more we're seeing articulated, focused briefs that are crystal clear in terms of the business impact that's required. Media as a lever of growth. So as I said, look, the business impact is important. Media used to be kind of, it's media, but now actually media is seen by more clients, more advertisers as being a core part of driving growth and driving profit. Systems integration, I as an advertiser will bring my own systems to the table. What can you as an agency bring to the table, and how can you integrate into my own systems, right? Because obviously advertising and digital especially is really about data, systems, technology more and more. So how do they integrate, how do they speak together, if you'd like? And that kind of creates a bespoke setup, right? It is, as I said earlier, it's not just the sort of, here's my brief, agency X, can you make this happen? It's, I'm looking for a bespoke setup. I'm looking for you to service me, agency X, in a very specific way against my specific needs. Consultative and future facing. So we see more and more where advertisers are articulating to their potential partners their ambition, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. What do we want to achieve? And how do we expect you to help us deliver that for our business overall? And that is, planning, buying plus, essentially, planning and buying is the core of what agencies do in many ways, whether it's digital or media, or broader media. But there is so much more, right? It's planning, buying, plus a bunch of other stuff, right? Plus technology, plus data, plus delivering business value, plus, all this stuff, right? And it kind of comes back to this, right? Clear requirements, articulated ambition. I won't steal Tim's thunder, but obviously that is really important. So I want this capability in-house, and I want this as a partner, third party. And therefore not just an agent, right? Not just an agent, but a partner, the partnership. And more balanced evaluation, as I said earlier, in terms of the commercials and the more sort of subjective, intangible areas as well. How do we sort of make sense of, if we see 3 or 4 or 5 agencies in this process, how do we evaluate them? How do we base fair evaluation outside of just the commercials? And that covers, things like this: the quality of capability, the talent, very important, and data and tech. So, consolidate or fragment, it isn't really a question of, what's right or wrong. Of course it's not. It's about what's right for your organization. And we often tell our clients to start with these 4 questions, right? How do I define the digital capability I require? So, in the highly complex and confusing world of digital, MarTech and AdTech, formats and buying methodologies and whatnot, what do you actually need? Then when you know that, how do I organize it? Where do you put things and how do you get them there? And what partners do you need? Because what you want within each of those disciplines, whether you see digital as a whole or sub-disciplines, is best in class, right? It's what we all want, really. And importantly, how do I ensure it's future-proof, right? As I said earlier, how do you kind of have that conversation about, well, I'm here now, but in 3 years, I want to be here, 5 years here, 10 years here, right? And how can you, as an agency, flex to accommodate that? That will give you a media management model in terms of where you sort of plot yourself on fragmentation versus consolidation. And then you move into your modus operandi in terms of how things actually work on the ground and BAU.